Hi, my name's Anne and I'm going to read to you from my book Tui Street Tales. Um, this is a book about a group of friends called the Tui Street Kids, and they all live in this little no exit street that you can see here. These are the kids watching Louis, one of the kids that lives in their street, as he flies on a shape-shifting tui. And the inside the book, you can actually see the street more clearly. There's a map, and you can see the street here, and it tells you, it's got a key to tell you where each of the kids lives. So I'm going to read the first story called Jack and the Morepork, and you can see a picture of a morepork at the very front of it. So I'll read that to you right now. In front of Jack's house in Tui Street grew a very tall tree. It stretched far up over the house and garden and way up into the summer sky, so far that nobody could see the top. Each day the tree's shadows spilled across Tim's house next door like a long ink stain that shifted with the sun. "Where do you think it ends?" Jack asked Tim one day, staring up through the branches. "Outer space?" Tim stopped heading a soccer ball and shrugged. "There's a morepork in that tree," he said, looking up. "I hear it when I'm in bed." He began to imitate the peaceful hooting sound that often helped him fall asleep. "Oh, oh, oh, oh." "Yeah, I hear it too," Jack said. "Mum calls it a ruru." He frowned. "Don't think it'll last long, though. That giant up there will eat it." "Giant?" Tim scoffed. "Giants don't exist, Jack. And if they did, why would they be in a tree?" Jack shook his head slowly. "You know that homework Mr. Tamati gave us?" "You mean the fairy tale project?" "Yeah. We have to look for fairy tale things in our own lives." "We didn't mean look for giants in a tree, Jack." Tim threw the soccer ball up and headed it so that it hit the tree trunk. He said to think about how we deal with difficult situations, like how Rapunzel... Nah. "Don't you see?" Jack interrupted. "My name's Jack, and that tree goes into the clouds, just like a beanstalk. And then there's the..." Jack faltered. The what?" Jack looked around cautiously. "Come with me," he whispered. He led Tim through the front door of the house and into the kitchen. Quietly, he opened a drawer and pulled out a huge spoon, almost as long as his arm. "Mum bought this yesterday," Jack whispered. "It's too big to fit in a human's mouth." Tim's mouth felt dry. "Well, it's a stupid project," he said. "Why does Mr. Tamati want us to study fairy tales anyway?" "Mum must know about the giant," Jack continued. "She's obviously feeding him." "Feeding him?" "Yeah. You know, she does that with people," Jack answered. "Now it looks like she's feeding giants." He put the large spoon on the bench and looked at it. "This is fact 3. "What's fact 1? Tim's voice wavered slightly. "Fact 1 is my name. Fact 2 is the tree. And now the spoon." Jack sighed, putting the long, wide spoon back in the drawer. "The ruru's in danger, Timbo." That night, Tim couldn't sleep. Each time he closed his eyes, the large spoon spun before him. Sometimes it made a clanging sound as if clashing against metal or large teeth. What if there was a giant in the tree, hanging by his ankles from a sturdy branch, about to sandwich the morepork between its rotten-toothed jaws? Tim had to do something. A sound at his door made him jump. "Tim? Dad!" Tim let out a relieved breath. "You okay? Saw you tossing and turning." Tim sighed. "Dad, how do you know if something's a fact?" Tim's father thought for a moment. "You have to prove whether something's true or not before you can call it a fact. So, if you think a large spoon means someone bigger than a human eats with it, that's not really a fact until..." Tim swallowed. He didn't want to hear the words come from his mouth. His father finished the sentence. "Well, it's not a fact until you see someone larger than a human actually eating with it. Otherwise, it's just a guess or a hypothesis like you do in science." He leant down to ruffle Tim's short, sandy hair. "Observe closely, Tim. That's the key to good detective work." During the night, Tim woke often. Sometimes he thought he heard the Morepork calling. Sometimes uninvited giants invaded his dreams, their large, toothy grins looming over him, feathers falling from their lips and clinging to their chins. In the early morning, Tim woke to a tapping sound. Someone was outside his window. "Fact number 4, a voice called, "and 5. Tim leapt out of bed and whipped back the curtains. Beneath Tim's window stood Jack in his pyjamas. His curly brown hair hadn't been combed, and bits of it stood up on end. "Meet me in my backyard," Jack called. "Something I've got to show you." Jack was standing underneath his clothesline, whirling it around. Tim had to weave and duck like a boxer to avoid being slapped in the face by dewy clothes. Despite his best efforts at avoiding them, a pair of Jack's mum's undies flew loose and hit him in the face. Jack laughed. "Get them off me!" Tim swatted them away. Yanking the washing line to a halt, Jack's laugh faded. "Look at this," he said. In front of Jack and Tim, with legs as large and wide as sleeping bags, a huge pair of blue jeans hung. Beside them were 2 enormous green soccer shirts, almost half the size of a soccer goal. Printed on the back of each was an orange number and a name, Stratford on one and Rimu written on the other. "I don't understand," Jack muttered. "Feeding a giant and doing his washing. He'll never go now. He'll stay in that tree forever." With a frustrated push, he sent the washing line off in another frenzy of spinning, clothes flapping wildly. "What about the Morepork?" Tim asked. "It'll definitely get eaten, Timbo." From the kitchen window, Jack's father's voice soared across the whir of the washing line. "Jack, what are you doing? Leave the clothesline alone." Tim reached up and brought the spinning spokes to a standstill. "Who are Stratford and Rimu?" "I don't know," Jack answered, gazing at the huge letters. The R for Rimu was as wide as his chest. Tim reached up and traced the letters with his finger. "Dad said it's not a fact until we have proof. It's just a hypothesis." "Like in science?" Jack asked. Tim nodded. It did seem as though Jack's mum was up to something, but they really had no clear evidence yet. Then he remembered. "Fact 5, you said there was a fact 5. "Come with me," Jack said quietly. Tim followed Jack around to the front of the house. "Here," Jack said. He leant down and picked up some nails lying on the grass by the roots of the tall tree. "They haven't been here long, or Dad would have mowed over them." His voice was almost a whisper. "Why would these be here?" "Anyone doing any building?" Tim asked. Jack shook his head. "Fixing something up?" Jack shook his head again. "Fact 5, Tim." "Yeah, but it's not a fact until we can prove it. Your sister could have left these nails here. She always carries strange stuff around in her little backpack." Jack shook his head. "Aroha can't reach the nails. They're on the top shelf in the garage." Tim tapped his foot impatiently. "Jack, it's not a fact until we observe and get proof." Jack looked up at the tree, then back at his friend. "Okay," he said, "let's make a plan." Slinging his arm around Tim's shoulders, they began to walk. "But let's do it at your house, Timbo. Mum'll hear us here." Because Tim's bedroom window offered the best view of the tree, Jack slept at Tim's house that night, and any contact with the giant, they thought, would probably be made under cover of darkness. Their plan was to stay awake all night to observe any movements near the tree. Positioned at each end of the curtain, the boys watched the tree under the huge silver moon. As the night deepened, the Morepork's soft chant began to weave its sleepy spell on Tim. His eyelids began to droop, just as his head began to sink into his chest. Jack's voice snapped him back to attention. "It's Mum!" Jack's mother was under the tree. She wore a woolen beanie with her long black hair tucked up under it. Clever disguise, Tim thought. A neighbour out for a late-night walk would never recognise her. Checking quickly behind her, she pulled a torch from her backpack and pointed it upwards. 5 quick, bright flashes of light bolted up through the branches. Jack gasped. A code! From the treetop, a rope ladder snaked clumsily down to Jack's mum. She grabbed it and placed one foot on the bottom rung. For a moment, she lost her balance and swung to the left. Then, straightening and checking around her once more, she began her second attempt. This time she stayed steady. With both feet firmly on the ladder, she began to climb. Fact 6, Jack whispered. Tim nodded, his eyes glued to the tree. Could Jack's mum really be climbing that tree in the middle of the night? His stomach lurched at the thought of what they should do next. Jack, we've got to follow her now, before that ladder disappears. The hallway creaked as they tiptoed over it. Jack bumped into a shelf, knocking over a photo frame. The clatter filled the silent house. Both boys froze. Surely Tim's dad would wake up. Jack imagined trying to explain this to him. A few heart-racing seconds later, they heard soft snoring coming from Tim's father's room. The boys let themselves out the front door. Through the hot night, the boys ran to the tall tree. Hoisting themselves up the ladder, they began to climb, rung after rung, higher and higher, until the houses beneath them were tiny matchboxes, and Tui Street was just a thin smudge below. The higher they climbed, the more the ground disappeared, so that soon the only sound in the thin night air was the heave and rasp of their breath and the slap of their bare feet on the ladder rungs. Looking down, Tim felt his stomach twist sickeningly at the enormous black space between him and the faint lights of the world far below. Up and on, as if the ladder might end at the moon. Finally above him, Jack stopped. Listen, he whispered. Voices trickled down through the branches above. Laughter sing-songed through the night air. That's Mum, Jack said, climbing towards the sound. The murmured chatter from above became closer and louder. Above their heads they could see a wooden platform wedged between thick branches. Without hesitation, Jack scrambled up the last few rungs, clasped the end of the platform and heaved himself up onto it, muttering Fact 7. For the first time ever, Jack's mother was speechless. Her mouth dropped into a long O shape. The boys, though, noticed only the giant. He wasn't ugly and toothless like the one from Tim's nightmares. He was young, maybe even their age. His hair was dark brown, and his large brown eyes were friendly. He sat with his back against the tree trunk, his long legs stretching across the uneven floor beneath them. Beside him, Jack's mother looked like a toddler. He wore the jeans and the green rimu top from the washing line that morning. Pillows were nestled behind the giant's head and the tree trunk. Jack noticed his mother had used the pillowcase with the kuru shape on it that she'd bought from the school gala. Why would she use that one? It was her favourite. I see you've found us, Jack's mum finally said. This is George, boys. George, this is my son Jack, and his friend Tim. George smiled and lifted his giant hand in a small wave. Wincing, he lowered it onto his lap again. Jack noticed a large bandage wrapped around the giant's elbow. Even in the moonlight, he could see the bandage had pictures of Batman and the Joker on it. Batman's scrunched-up face gazed unevenly at him from George's arm. George looked at his mother. That's my old Batman sheet. It was my favourite. We have lots of sheets, Jack, his mum replied. Anyway, I'll wash it. I hurt my arm coming down the tree, George explained. The floorboards vibrated as he spoke. Leaves fluttered past Jack's face. George's voice was as large as his body. A couple of nights ago, said Jack's mum, I was in bed. when I heard a loud thud. I looked outside, and there he was, lying on the grass. She helped me, George continued, and she built this. He patted the floorboards. Jack looked at the floorboards, still annoyed about his sheet. It took him a moment to really notice them. Nails, he said aloud. Fact 5, Tim. She used the nails to build this. Tim nodded, still staring at the giant boy. When I was little, Jack's mother said, we were taught to always make people welcome in our house and on our marae. I would have invited George to stay, but he'd have needed to slide on his side to get through our doors, and I was worried people might stare at him or tease him. In fact, you boys will need to keep this a secret. Turning to George, she explained, humans don't have much experience with giants. Can we just tell Ella or Terry or the twins? Jack said. None of them, Jack. What about Lucy? She's always making up stories, and Jack, you mustn't mention George to any of the Tui Street kids, his mother said. That's okay, Tim intervened. We can keep a secret, eh, Jack? With a frustrated snort, Jack nodded. Turning to George, he asked, why'd you climb down the tree anyway? George smiled slowly, as if something special were appearing before him. His large face softened. To see the bird, he said, just to see what it looked like. I wanted to see its colours, how big it was. The Morepork, Tim interrupted. Yeah, it helps me sleep at night. Our house is near where this tree pokes through the clouds. I just wanted to see what was making that peaceful sound, but now my parents must be so worried about me. One giant tear slid down George's cheek, making a small puddle on the wooden floor beneath them. Jack's mum patted George's arm. When his arm's better, he can climb back home. In the meantime, he's a bit lonely. You'd feel lonely too, Jack. Think of how much you'd miss Aroha. Jack thought of his younger sister and how she often messed up his room when he wasn't home and scribbled over his drawings. He shook his head. I wouldn't miss Aroha. Jack's mother's eyebrows rose. I think you would, actually. I'd miss Dad, Jack said. His father told good jokes and coached Jack's soccer team. Yep, he'd miss his dad. George interrupted Jack's thoughts. Do you guys play cards? He asked. Reaching into his shorts pocket, George pulled out an enormous pack of cards. Jack and Tim gasped. The cards were as long as a skateboard. On the backs of the cards were huge, giant faces. This is my new pack, George continued. Got it for my birthday. He flicked through the pack, stirring up leaves and dust around him as he did so. Look, the cards have got pictures of all my favourite soccer players. Rimu and Stratford are the best, though. Jack looked at Tim. Rimu, he said. Tim nodded. And Stratford. Maybe we could have a game tomorrow, George suggested. Lifting those cards, Tim laughed. Oh, it could be a long game. George's uncertain smile slid into a look of disappointment. But we could give it a go, Tim said. Hey, Jack. Wait, Jack said. Before we make any plans, I have to ask you something. He looked the giant boy in the eye. George, were you planning to eat the Morepork? George's eyes widened. Me? No, it helps me sleep. Jack looked at George with a long, slow stare. He'd seen Mr. Tamati do it at school if he suspected someone wasn't being honest. George didn't seem uncomfortable, though. Instead, he smiled expectantly. Jack began to speak. Fact 7, Jack, Tim interrupted. He put his hand on his friend's shoulder and lowered his voice to a whisper. Case closed. I hope you've enjoyed Jack and the Morepork, and you'll be able to look at the other stories over the next few days. Bye.